So welcome everyone to the 2025 William J. Perry Lecture Series in association with the Ewha GSIS Distinguished Global Lecture Series. As you know, today we have the honor of having Ms. Wendy Cutler, Vice President, Asia Society Policy Institute, and former Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative with us today. She will be talking about situation that we are all very, very interested in, the relationships with the U.S., the trade situation around the world. My name is Jie-ae, and you can see from up there, I am a invited professor at the Graduate School of International GSIS. I am also a director at the Pacific Century Institute, and I believe a Korea representative as well, yes, of the Pacific Century Institute, which is co-hosting our event today. This is the 5th year that this lecture series is being held at Ewha, and it is, of course, named for Mr. William J. Perry, who was the former Secretary of Defense of the United States, and was a big force in the peace and prosperity process on the Korean Peninsula. And so I think at the age of 97, I think today, he is still, I am sure, most up to date on what is going on here in the Korean Peninsula and around the world. And he would have been here if he could, I'm sure. So to mark this important figure in history, as well as his dedication to the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, we have conducted the William J. Lecture Series in Korea in Ewha for the 5th time. And so I am very happy to be able to open this day today. And first of all, we'd like to invite our president of the Ewha Women's University, President Lee Hyang-suk, to the podium to give us her welcoming remarks, followed by the president's remarks. I think we have a short video giving you an outline of the William Perry Lecture Series at Ewha. So President Lee.
Good afternoon. Today's distinguished speaker, Vice President Wendy Cutler, Chairman Spencer Kim, and members of the Pacific Century Institute, and esteemed faculty, staff, and students of Ewha Women's University. I am Hyang-suk Lee, the 18th President of Ewha. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to Ewha Women's University and to this year's William J. Perry Lecture. I'm especially honored to deliver my first official remarks as president at this prestigious lecture series, which has become a meaningful tradition at Ewha since 2021. I'd like to express my sincere appreciation for our continued partnership with the Pacific Century Institute, a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles. A nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles founded to build bridges between countries and people. The PCI's mission to foster education, policy, dialogue, and research is truly embodied in the William J. Perry Lecture Series, which has been made possible through the generous sponsorship and support of PCI co-founder Spencer Kim and President Raymond Burghardt. The lecture series is named in honor of William J. Perry, in the 19th United States Secretary of Defense, who played a pivotal role in reshaping U.S. foreign policy. In particular, he led efforts resulting in the 1994 Agreed Framework signed in Switzerland, through which has United States, South Korea, Japan, and others committed to supporting North Korea in exchange for the dismantling of its nuclear weapon facilities. In tribute to Secretary Perry's achievement in promoting peace and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, the PCI established this lecture series in 2016. Ewha has had the privilege of hosting it since 2021. Each year, the William J. Perry Lecture invite distinguished individuals who have dedicated their lives to public service and leadership. It offers our community the opportunity to learn from their expertise, experience, and insight. In past years, who have welcomed outstanding figures such as Janet Napolitano and former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Catherine Stevens, former U.S. Ambassador to Korea, Robert Gallucci, former U.S. Ambassador at Large, and Siegfried Hecker, former Director of Los Alamos National Lab. The lecture series is co-organized by Ewha's Graduate School of International Studies as part of its distinguished global lecture series, which is dedicated to preparing women leaders for the global stage. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dean Brandon Howe and Professor Jie-ae Sohn of GSIS for their dedication and efforts in organizing today's event. Before we invite Vice President for International Affairs, Young-jin Cho, to introduce today's distinguished speaker, please enjoy a short video presentation prepared by Ewha's PR team, showcasing the history and spirit of William J. Perry Lecture Series. Thank you.
Before the pandemic started, in terms of trying to get the lectures scheduled, etc., and our persistence has paid off and has brought me to this. You'll hear these.
But also in the United States. And I guess my other kind of background on this is, and to become kind of forgiving, kind of Gyo-Yuk-Pyong, I think it does come a little bit out of this hypercare in a variety of posts. But one thing she said.
First nuclear reactor, was peaceful, but it failed to some extent, holding a nuclear weapon ever blowing up again.
Does not happen. Many other countries produce weapons 15 minutes for big speech. So the trying to change without reference to the chairman of Joint Chiefs Staff.
Hello, I'm Young-jin Cho, the Vice President of International Affairs at Ewha Women's University, and we're especially honored today to host a distinguished guest and a leading figure in international policy, intertrade diplomacy, Ms. Wendy Cutler. So Ms. Cutler currently serves as Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and over the course of a nearly 30-year career at U.S. Trade Representative's Office, she played a very pivotal role in shaping a major trade agreement, including U.S.-Korea, Korea-U.S. FTA, as well as a very complex negotiation surrounding a Trans-Pacific Partnership. So at a time when global trade continues to face significant headwinds, Ms. Cutler's insight, experience, and leadership are more relevant than ever. And I'm also very delighted to introduce Professor Jie-ae Sohn, who would facilitate the conversation today. A very respected former journalist and the first woman to lead a Korea International Broadcasting Foundation. Professor Jie-ae Sohn would bring a wealth of experience and perspective to this dialogue. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Ms. Wendy Cutler as well as Professor Jie-ae Sohn.
Again, thank you. This is a great honor. And I am very happy to be able to sit down and talk with you. I have a lot of my students here, and they've been told to ask questions. So at some point, we're going to throw open to the floor and hopefully get some of our students who come from all around the world to add their interest and their questions into the fold. But, let's start with the fact that in terms of talking about the U.S.-Korea economic relations today, the foremost on everyone's mind is obviously what's going on with the Trump administration. It just happens to be that just a couple of days ago, it was the 100 days of Trump, and I think a lot of international media is calling it the 100 days of Trump. And I don't know if any other U.S. president in modern time has gotten this much attention. And it's partly because of the dizzying array of policies and changes that he's brought about. But almost the foremost, most important one that people have been talking about is the one in the economic area, especially the reciprocal tariffs and the trade. Wendy, you've been a trade negotiator. You've served in various U.S. administrations. You've seen Trump won. Did the past 100 days surprise you? Are you surprised by what's been happening?
Okay, before I answer that question, I just want to really thank Ewha University for inviting me here. It's such an honor to join this lecture series, and I want to thank also Spencer Kim for inviting me. And when I watched the video of the former speakers, I was a bit humbled and overwhelmed, so I'll do my best today, but again, very honored. Okay, now to your question.
Yes.
Yes, I was surprised. And when people say they were surprised, other Americans will say, well, why were you surprised? Because during the campaign, Trump was very clear. He loved tariffs. He planned to impose tariffs against everyone.
Yeah.
And he went ahead and he did that. But what surprised me, a few things. One was how quickly this all happened. So if you remember in Trump 1.0, while he did impose tariffs, he focused on certain sectors like steel and aluminum, and he really focused on China. And he didn't hit our allies and partners for the most part. But this time around, he not only went after China, but he went after our allies and partners, including our free trade agreement partners, our FTA partners like Korea, which I'm sure shocked Korea. He also started using tariffs not just to achieve trade goals, but also to deal with foreign policy issues. So some of the earliest tariffs he imposed during his 100 days were against Mexico and Canada, dealing with migration and drug interdiction, and then he hit China, and then he threatened Colombia. So a much more expansive use of tariffs. And the rates were much higher than previous, than during Trump 1.0. And when I think of the the high tariffs we have now against China, right? So Trump has imposed 145% tariff on China, all goods with some exceptions. But I think what's interesting too is that we already had some tariffs in place with China. So some of the tariffs on imports from China are over 170% now. And at that level, trade really slows down, to say the least.
Yeah, stops. But as you say, these are all reciprocal tariffs, as he, to balance the trade imbalances, unfair trade imbalances that he's called, which sort of, and now we're in a 90-day reprieve, 90 days where all of these countries are scurrying to negotiate down their tariffs. In that process, as a trade negotiator, you understand that actually, the key to all of that is actually knowing your opponent, your counterpart. Help us a little bit understand. You talked a little bit about, what President Trump is after, but give us a little bit more about what the tariffs mean for the Trump administration or President Trump.
So President Trump, depending on the day, he will express different objectives for the tariffs. So some days it's just all about negotiating leverage. And frankly, that's what the Treasury Secretary keeps talking about. It's all negotiating leverage, right? He also talks about what you said was about lowering the trade deficits, equalizing our relations with other countries, getting the trade deficit down, getting rid of unfair trade practices. He furthermore sees tariffs as incentives to invite more foreign direct investment to the United States. But then he's also using tariffs to earn revenue to offset some of the big tax cuts he plans to implement shortly. And so with all of these objectives, it gets confusing. And frankly, some of them are cross purposes.
They cross paths and actually outdo the what he's trying to do with another.
Right. So if you're saying it's for negotiating leverage, then you assume if the other country moves sufficiently, you're going to get rid of the tariffs. But if you need them to raise revenue, you want to keep some of them. And so again, some of these objectives don't really line up.
But of them, can you prioritize these objectives to know that, as you said in the beginning, it's a day-by-day thing, but nevertheless, is there a priority of the real objective or the most important objective?
Again, it depends on the day.
So in this process, let's talk strategy. So what do you do as a negotiating partner? Some have thought, okay, is it better to go first? Because, in Korea, there's a saying, 매도 먼저 맞는 게 좋다. It's like if you're going to get punished anyway, it's better to do it, forget it, and get punished first. And I guess that's what, countries like Korea or Japan have been sort of singled out as sort of the countries that will be negotiated with first. Is that a good thing?
Yeah, so President Trump and his team, they've identified kind of four priority countries in the for negotiations during this 90-day reprieve period. And that includes Korea, but also includes Japan, India, and Vietnam. And all of these delegations are coming to Washington along with many other delegations from other countries. And yes, there is a question, are we better off, as you said, just swallowing that bitter pill, doing what we need to do, doing it quickly? And in fact, the White House has said at certain moments that the earlier you are, the better off you're going to be. But I think there is some skepticism growing with that, and I think countries are beginning to think, maybe we're better off not rushing to do the deal. And the reason why some of them are saying this is because they're looking at moves the White House is taking to kind of backtrack from some of the bold tariff actions they've taken. So for example, the administration with respect to tariffs against China have now excluded lots of electronic products, and I think that's about 20% of our imports from China. at least for now. He is also, again, he put the tariffs in place, but then he said, well, wait a second, I'm going to let countries have a 90-day reprieve period. So we're seeing some backtracking. And so when you're a negotiator, you're thinking about, the timing of all of this. And maybe if I wait a few more weeks, there'll be more pressure on the other side than on me. So maybe I'm better off kind of slow walking the negotiation because timing is so important in trade negotiations. And I used to tell my team when they came here during the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, I knew we'd have negotiating rounds, and I'd bring around 100 people with me here to Korea, and the Korean side would have 100 people. And certain rounds, I knew not a lot was going to happen because for whatever reason, either we weren't ready or Korea wasn't ready to make those hard bargains. And so you really have to have a good sense of timing about when this might all come together, and you need to be ready and you need to be prepared. But I've never seen anything like trying to negotiate with, let's just say, 70 countries in 90 days, okay? The U.S.
Is
Korea,
that even possible?
Well, I'm not saying it's impossible. I think it's doable. What I have noticed, though, and what a distinction to make, the U.S.-Korea FTA is, an agreement with about 30 chapters, hundreds of pages of legal text of rules, and then like hundreds of pages of the tariff schedule. That isn't what these agreements are going to look like during the 90 days. And in fact, if you listen to the administration, they're talking more and more about these are framework agreements. These are going to be memoranda of understanding. These are going to be terms of reference. So there's even some backtracking there about what exactly countries need to negotiate. And so my understanding is they'll kind of agree on like an outline of the negotiations during the 90 days with as many countries as possible. And then they'll spend the next months and maybe in certain cases years hammering out those details because trade negotiations is a very, very detailed exercise.
No. How long did it take you to do the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement?
Well, we moved extremely quickly. We moved we did the negotiation in less than a year, which was,
super,
very quick.
super
If I
fast.
think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, and now that involved 11 other countries, that was underway for about 8 years. And so, again, each negotiation has its own pace and its own timing. One of the reasons we moved so quickly in the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement was that we had congressional authority called Trade Promotion Authority, which was going to expire it was going to expire, so we needed to meet that deadline in order for our Congress to consider the agreement on what we thought would be a fast-track basis. It took them about 5 years later to actually put this into effect, but small detail.
Yeah. Well, before these tariffs were rolled out, they were talking about this FTA agreement sort of setting the table, and so there might not be one of the reasons that Korea was shocked was because of the FTA. Now no one talks about the FTA anymore. Is it just out the window?
No, it's not out the window. It's still in effect. However, again, if you're a free trade agreement partner, that includes Korea, Australia, Singapore, Canada, Mexico. All these countries are thinking this isn't fair. We concluded a very detailed negotiation with the United States, an agreement that was approved by Congress. We made a lot of concessions. We lowered our tariffs, almost all of them, to zero. So if you're talking about reciprocal tariffs, it's 0 for 0. It's very confusing. And what Trump, when it comes to Korea, what he would say is, well, wait a second. Our trade deficit with Korea is over $60 billion. It was only $23 billion during Trump 1.0. So it's increasing significantly, and that means that there's unfairness in the system. And the FTA didn't solve that problem, so we need to solve it.
So one of the things that Korea looks at is, especially because Korea at the present time is going through a political situation of its own, is Japan. And I think, I was talking to someone, a Japanese official, and the Japanese prime minister was one of the first ones to have a summit with President Trump, and they are one of the first ones to negotiate. I asked him, did flattery work? And he said, no. People thought flattery would work, because that's sort of what, for example, it happened and Trump won. So is flattery not going to work?
Well, I think it still works, but again, it's timing, because if you look at Prime Minister Ishiba, who came to Washington before all the tariffs, he had a great meeting in the Oval Office with the president. He announced new investments by Japanese companies in the United States. He talked about cooperation in a lot of different areas, and I think he felt pretty good when he went home, only to see next week that didn't make a difference. One formula was used to basically calculate the tariff rate for most countries, and there was the formula wasn't tailored at all to keep in mind steps countries have taken or whether they're FTA partners. So I think that's what you're referring to, that maybe in that case flattery didn't work. But let's look at the Mexican president, right, Claudia Sheinbaum, and she's mentioned as someone who's just played this really well, both domestically and with Trump. She has addressed a lot of his concerns about migration and fentanyl. She flatters him all the time on their phone calls. And again, she's someone who is getting along with Trump, also very popular at home. So again, I think she's kind of figured it out, and I think other leaders are trying to do the same thing.
That balance between the flattery and the timing and what you give, all of that. But Korea and Japan are two countries which have taken a more conciliatory type of attitude. But on the other side, like the EU, they've taken a very different stance towards the trade. How is that happening? How is that having an effect?
Well, for one, you don't see the EU in active negotiations with the White House, right? And so while Korea and the Japanese delegations seem to be coming to town every week, the Europeans have been, let's just say, not as present. There are talks going on. But look, Europe's a much bigger, much larger economy of 27 member states. And so they have more negotiating leverage than a small country. Interestingly enough, they talked about retaliation, but they have suspended their retaliation. I find that very interesting because typically they do respond like China, and you're going to put a tariff in, we're going to respond. They chose not to this time around. And again, they're suspending their tariffs, so maybe they'll put them in effect at some point. But they're not. They are not on. I don't think they're on the fast track to conclude a negotiation in the coming weeks. Maybe within the 90 days, but not in the coming weeks.
So they have a different type of formula in terms of not all tough, but maybe tough on the outside and maybe negotiating a little bit backwards themselves.
Exactly. They're trying to figure out the best way to work with this White House.
Of all the different types of trade negotiations that you're seeing right now, what seems to be a strategy that works?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. But again, I think the countries that have come to Washington with stuff in their pockets to give to Trump, whether it be in Korea's case, talking about shipbuilding cooperation or cooperation on LNG in Alaska, that's highly valued by the administration. And so having concessions in your pocket, and also I think just being in constructive negotiations with the White House. Because one thing in negotiations, you can tell if a country's negotiating in good faith, or they're just kind of delaying, they're not really serious, they didn't really come with anything. I think there's no doubt in my mind that Korea has been very serious. And to underscore that, when the Korean team was in Washington last week, Secretary Besson, the Treasury Secretary, he said Korea was on their A game, and that he thought negotiations could be concluded, rapidly, but very positive about how prepared and how conciliatory the Korean delegation was.
At the same time, the Korean delegation today I read the paper that they were saying, "Oh, we're not in that much of a hurry. That's going a little too far than we're ready to do." Overall, though, how do you see the South Korean trade negotiations going with the U.S.?
I mean, I think overall they're going extremely well, particularly compared to most other countries. But Korea, like other countries, they're going to have some hard decisions to make, right? So even if they're prepared to give certain things, they also want to get certain things. And a minimum, I'm sure they want to get the rollback of the existing tariffs and some kind of assurance that future Trump tariff hikes won't apply to them, right? Some kind of standstill. And, both of those may be difficult to achieve. There is talk in Washington that the White House has no intention of reducing the reciprocal tariffs below 10% for anyone, any country. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if the president has flexibility with respect to certain countries. We'll just have to see how this plays out.
Yeah. When these trade negotiations happen and, concessions that are made and cooperation is done, it has an impact on the overall industrial structure, especially domestically in Korea. How do you see the impact of these kind of tariff negotiations on the Korean industry as a whole?
Well, I mean, look, the Korean economy is a very export-oriented economy. And so, they value access to the U.S. market. And so if through these negotiations they get more access, not only they get more access, then, that will help companies and their workers in Korea. Also, through these negotiations, the president is encouraging companies from other countries to invest in the United States. Now, one could argue, and I've seen articles in Korea, that there is some concern that a lot of your key companies, if they're investing so much in the United States, what are they doing in Korea? And so I'm not sure that impact will need to be studied. But again, Korea in the past has been a leader of free trade and a proponent of a rules-based, multilateral trading system. So I think, free trade is very much in Korea's DNA. Unfortunately, it's no longer in the U.S. DNA.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I would say that it's not just with respect to President Trump, but President Biden as well. A lot of people expected after Trump 1.0 that Biden would come in and just reverse everything and we'd be back doing all these trade agreements. That did not happen. So there's a real shift in the United States towards trade policy and a feeling that maybe at one time the U.S. benefited from all of this trade, but particularly in recent years, we've been we've been disadvantaged and other countries have benefited at our expense.
Unfortunately for Korea, as you say, the export-oriented industry structure is still very much the case. And especially when you're talking about, Korea's two biggest trade partners, U.S. and China, export markets, being in this trade war. It's one of the most concerning things for Korea going forward. How do you see the prospects of the U.S.-China relationship reaching some sort of deal? I mean, this 200% tariffs cannot go on.
Yeah.
Can
So at the present point, we're at a stalemate with China. We both have very high tariffs in place. And there is, the president keeps saying, I'm talking to the Chinese, and the Chinese say, I don't know what he's talking about, we're not talking. At some point, I think the two sides will need to get together, and I'm hoping that can happen this fall, particularly given some of these big international meetings coming up where the U.S. could have the opportunity to meet with China. China has taken a pretty hardline position this time around. I think they feel that they can't trust the current administration. They feel that they're being penalized, and they feel that over time, they're going to have more negotiating leverage than the United States. So we've already seen President Trump and his team back off of some of the tariffs they put in place by, providing exclusions for tariffs with China. Again, providing this 90-day tariff-free negotiating period. And so I think the Chinese feel that time is on their side and that Trump will be under increasing pressure by U.S. workers, by U.S. companies, by the stock market, by the bond market, and companies not investing but waiting, which could bring down our GDP. So I think China thinks that time is on its side.
Do you think the time is on China's side?
Well, look, China has their issues as well, and they're very extremely export-oriented country. And even with tensions between the United States and China, we still have over $600 billion of two-way trade. And so there is a lot of trade going on, and Chinese goods are in a lot of the supply chains of goods coming in from other countries. So there is a trade relationship, but we're already seeing with these high tariffs in place that the cargo between the two countries is declining dramatically.
Yeah, I saw
and
those
this is
figures,
going
yeah.
to impact China. Now, Xi Jinping has been planning for this since Trump 1.0. Chinese dependence on the U.S. market has gone down. They found other trading partners. You take a product like soybeans. China imports more soybeans from South America than from Brazil than to the United States. They've reduced their dependency on the U.S. market. But that said, they still export a lot to the United States. And so, they're going to feel the hurt. Maybe, they'll be able, through domestic measures, to cushion the blow to average Chinese citizens and small businesses and the larger companies. But they're going to feel this. And so my view is that at a certain point, both sides, for their own reason, are going to decide we need to get back to the negotiating table. This is unsustainable. And I think that will happen. But if I were to predict, I don't think it will happen until the fall.
Oh, okay. Well, everyone's hoping it's the sooner the better, I think, yes. I think to give you a little time to maybe get some water, we're going to maybe throw open to questions from the floor, the front or the back. Anyone with a question, if you raise your hand, I think a mic will be passed to you. Please identify yourself first and maybe one question at a time.
Hello. So identify, my name is Yuli. I'm a student from Professor Sohn's class. So thank you for your discussion so far. I was wondering, how much would you say the past 100 days have affected the credibility of the US as a reliable trade partner? And would you say that the past 100 years, so the recent changes in trade policy, but also of the previous administrations, as you mentioned, could in the end impact or diminish the position of the US as a major power and instead give room for other countries to rise and expand their influence, especially China, as new trade alliances form?
That's a great question, and I think the credibility of the United States is clearly being questioned by a lot of countries right now, that many feel that they're not being treated right, that they should not be subjected to tariffs. And, things change week to week, and so it's very hard for them to kind of keep track of what's going on. In terms of the longer-term implications, we really don't know yet. But one thing I do hear from trading partners is that many viewed Trump 1.0 as kind of an aberration, and that it was kind of a one-off thing, and that the U.S. under Biden, we'd get back to more normal policies, and that would continue. But when Trump was reelected, and now we're in Trump 2.0, what I'm hearing from other countries is that, now they recognize that this isn't going away. Whatever in the United States, whatever the feelings are towards other countries and the U.S. view of their position in the world, that it's changed. And so whoever wins the next presidential election, don't expect that things are just going to go back to where they were, that we're kind of in a new world and we're all trying to kind of navigate this new scene. But I would not sign off the United States as a major international player. The U.S. has a lot going for it. We're an extremely resilient country. We have some of the most innovative companies. And so, again, I think I'm optimistic. But clearly, in my view, we're going through a bit of a rough patch now with our trading partners.
Yes. Any other question? Yes, in the back.
I'm Ngawong. I'm also Professor Sohn's student. My question was related to, you said the trade negotiations between Korea and America have been going well, but considering the coming elections, how do you think the dynamic is going to change? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah.
The midterm elections in November, yes.
Oh, the U.S.
U.S.
election,
elections, or are we the Korean election?
Korean
Oh,
election.
okay.
That's what
Maybe both.
Both. Yeah,
then.
yeah. So, one thing, when you negotiate trade agreements, and I've done, I did this for 30 years, there's always elections in countries, and they always complicate, something. And when I worked on the TPP and there were 12 countries, you can imagine someone always had an election coming up, right? And so you have to kind of navigate through that. In Korea, the election is going to happen during the short 90-day period. I think there was some concern in the beginning by the opposition party that the ruling party would rush into an agreement. My sense now is that the negotiations with Korea will continue beyond the election and may be successfully concluded in early July by the 90-day deadline. But again, this is something Korea needs to work out. But it's not the first time an election has taken place during an important negotiation. Interesting for me is that during the negotiations between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, the USMCA, there was a big election, right? And there was a new president, his short nickname, AMLO. And in Mexico, they have a really long transition period. So you elect a leader, and then it's 6 months later, the new leader takes office. And what AMLO said was that, I don't want to sign this agreement, right? I think he thought that someone was going to be blamed, and he didn't want to be that person. So he made that clear, which put all the pressure on the current administration at that time to conclude the negotiation. Now, that might have worked well for Mexico, right? But for the United States, as a trade negotiator, it was a really wrong move by AMLO. He should have just said it privately. Because once the U.S. negotiators knew that there was a real deadline here, okay, that the current president had to sign this agreement, the clock starts ticking. And guess who gets more leverage? It's the person who can kind of sit back, or the country that can sit back and say, oh, we can wait longer. And the other side is, no, we need to keep working and to do this. So it gets kind of complicated. Sometimes what you need to do for domestic reasons can affect your negotiating positions and strategies. And so when I look at that, I just think that if AMLO felt like that, he should have just had a private conversation with the current president and kind of kept that quiet, because it gave enormous negotiating leverage to the United States.
Basically shown your hand, really.
Exactly.
Maybe a question? Yes.
Hi, I'm Lucinda Walker, CEO of the British Chamber of Commerce in Korea. What do you think is the Trump administration's expectation of the timeline or the length of time that it will take for America's trade imbalances to be brought more into balance with this use of tariffs and these policies? Thank you.
Well, look, I think they're a bit impatient, and it's going to, in my view, this stuff doesn't happen overnight because trade agreements cannot solve trade deficits. Trade deficits happen for largely macroeconomic reasons. So a country like the United States, we consume a lot. Countries like China save a lot, okay? And also China, is putting so much emphasis in their economy on their export machine. And so, again, I think it will take a long time if we could ever balance these trade deficits. But I think what's key is you want to see the deficit at least on a downward trajectory, right? And so if these deals are concluded and bilateral trade deficits can keep increasing, I think that can really put a spotlight on certain countries. I think one of the reasons that the Trump administration is so concerned about Korea is that, remember, they assess these trade relationships by bilateral trade deficits. And I don't know the exact number, but Korea's trade deficit during Trump 1.0 was like $23 billion. And now it's like $66 billion. So it's clearly, almost tripled since Trump 1.0. And I think that's really put a target on Korea in particular during these negotiations.
Yeah, I think Korea is like number 5 in terms of trade deficits with the U.S., so it's quite high.
I'll tell you one country that during Trump 1.0 wasn't a problem is Vietnam, and their bilateral trade deficit is like double of Korea's, right? And a lot of the reason for that is many Chinese companies have moved to Vietnam to basically avoid the U.S. tariffs. So in our negotiations with Vietnam, we're putting a lot of pressure on them to take steps to kind of rein in those exports from Chinese companies in Vietnam. And so while there'll be similarities between all of these negotiations, for certain countries, there'll be different areas of emphasis.
Talking about timeline, I think Nawang was talking about, of course, the Korean election, but what about in terms of timeline, the midterm election coming up in the U.S.? How does that factor in?
Yeah, so the midterm elections will be a year from November, and at that point, right now, when we talk about midterm elections, those are congressional elections, and there'll be elections both for new senators as well as for new congressmen in the House of Representatives. Both now are controlled by the Republicans. Typically, in midterms, the party out of power, definitely, who's not in the White House, typically does better during the midterm elections. And so I think one of the reasons why the Trump administration may be, operating in kind of what looks like operating so quickly and being in a rush is they want to accomplish as much as possible by the midterm elections, because if the Democrats in particular take over the House of Representatives, they can block a lot of this stuff and make it more difficult for the Trump administration and hold hearings and, just make them, more accountable. But right now, in many respects, they have a free pass from Congress, even though, and I find this, fascinating because in my career, boy, I spent a lot of time not only with the foreign trading partner, but with Congress. And these were not fun meetings, right? Because you'd go up there and each member wanted more, or why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? And they, under our Constitution, Congress is in charge of trade and tariff policy. But a lot of that has been delegated to the executive branch over time. And so, again, I think one of the reasons for this fast-paced negotiations is a fear that if the Democrats end up in at least win one house of our Congress, that they can at least slow down, if not undo some of the stuff that Trump has put into effect.
You talk about the different political happenings within the U.S., but from the outside, people are looking forward in terms of how do I build my resilience against, the status of the U.S. that is now pretty much set. Things may change a little bit, but as you said, it's on this path that it's not going to substantially change. So how do countries outside of the U.S. Build up their resilience to what's happening in the U.S.?
Yeah, so it's all about building resilience. And frankly, a lot of it is about diversifying your trading partners and reducing your reliance on any trading partner in particular. And we are seeing that. Like China, if you look at, in 5 years, China's, in terms of its exports, they decreased dramatically to the United States versus other countries. It's interesting, Canada and Mexico are two neighbors. Over 75% of their exports come to the United States. So guess who has most of the leverage in that negotiation? It is the United States. But in Asia, it's very different. And for Korea, even though our trade has grown substantially, your largest trading partner is still China, and that's the same for Japan and most countries in Asia. And so it's again, a lot of countries are trying to diversify, to build up resiliency in their supply chains. So, they're not just relying on one country, one plant, that if something goes wrong there, either a policy matter or even a fire or drought, they have other sources to build their products. But this starts getting very expensive. And once you add tariffs on, a lot of the trade, when we've all gotten used to, a lot of trade going on since World War II, where prices have been brought down dramatically, and our product selection has increased significantly. And so people are worried that those benefits are maybe, we may start to lose them.
Yeah. We could sit here all afternoon talking, but I think we're sort of we're getting to the end. But I wanted to, your career as a trade negotiator has been illustrious, but it's also interesting, not interesting, but important, because you're a female trade negotiator, and I'm sure that in the beginning, you're probably the only female trade negotiator. Tell us how it was like to pioneer this area, and a lot of our students will pioneer a lot of new areas in their individual fields. Would trade negotiating be one area that they would, probably should look into?
So, it's interesting. When I look back at my career, and I look back when I was really young, and, the first negotiations I did, and I did a lot of negotiations with Japan at that time, and I always felt that it was all men on the other side of the table. And I always thought that they had a bet among themselves, like who could make Wendy cry the quickest. And one thing you learn is don't show your emotions. And if you cry or, start showing that you're stressed or whatever, then the other side just totally takes advantage of that. So, but what I also felt, and a lot of this is coming from being a negotiator from the United States, that once you proved yourself, you were kind of treated like everyone else, and maybe even more respected. And I really felt during the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement negotiations, which now are almost, the original ones are about 20 years old, I think being a female kind of worked to my advantage because I stood out, right? Again, mostly men on the other side, although I did meet, there were 3 female negotiators from the Korean side out of 100. And 2 of them are in the audience, I met them right before, and the other was Minister Yu, who later became trade minister. But on our side, I would say 40% of our delegation was female. But, I stood out when I did the press, and I smiled, so people kind of liked me. And I think they contrasted me to former U.S. negotiators who were negotiating in very tense and very adversarial conditions. Remember, a free trade agreement, we both wanted to do this, so US and Korea shared an objective. It didn't mean the negotiations were easy, not at all, but we had a common objective. And there was a point in the negotiation that I just had that sense that we were going to be successful. And frankly, many of my bosses doubted that. And as a result, I think they even gave me more latitude to negotiate because they thought maybe I'd be wasting my time. And so, it became, the largest FTA that we had done after our FTA with Canada and Mexico. But again, it was a time where, it was just a very interesting and dynamic and fluid time. I think trade negotiations are like a great career path, but the one thing I would say, if you like to be liked, it's not the profession you want to go into, because everyone is angry at you all the time, right? The other agencies that you have to work with, and because trade agreements cover so many, they cover health, they cover labor, and you have to work with all these different government agencies, and frankly, they don't want to make a lot of concessions, so you're arguing with them. Then you think, then you have your position, and then you've got to go to our Congress and get them. They never like what, they always want more. And then you go and you negotiate in the foreign country, and guess what? They don't like any of your proposals, right? They think you're asking way too much. And then you come back from the negotiating round, and guess what? You've got to go back to Congress, go back to the other agencies, and come up with more proposals. And no one's telling you you're doing a good job. If anything, everyone's, just trying
always angry at you.
You should be doing more, you should be nicer, you should be meaner, whatever. So if you like to be liked, it's not a good profession. But I also think that women bring a lot to the negotiating table. I think women tend to be consensus builders. We tend to listen better, and I can't emphasize how important listening is in anything you do in your career, listening to the other side. And I got to tell you, there were times in my negotiating career, I would give the other side a lot of time to explain their proposals, and inside my head, I'd be like, I could never agree to this. But I'd be really nice, and I would ask questions and seem really interested. And that went a long way at the negotiating table, because if you feel you're not being listened to, then you're very uneasy in the talks, and then you don't really want to find that common landing ground or landing zone. So again, the one thing I would say about women just generally in your careers, and I just really share this with folks, be confident. And I always, when people, and I've seen this because I hire people, but you put out a job advertisement, right? And I could say, these are 10 things I want, and I have nothing to lose, right? And women will look at these 10, the 10 qualifications, and they'll say, oh, I only qualify for 5 of these. I'd never apply for this job. But men are like, oh, this is gravy, I qualify for 3, and I can, I'm going to ace the interview. So I think it's really having that confidence is really important, to bring to anything you do in your careers. And I know we're ending. I'll just say finally, networking is so important. And so with a school like this, where you have so many international students and so many women from Korea, stay in touch. Work your networks, because this is going to help you in your career. It's helped me, and it's something I can't emphasize enough.
Thank you so much. I think it is a wonderful path for those who feel it is something that they would like to do and make a difference in the world. So thank you very much for your words, and join me in giving Ms. Wendy Cutler a big round of applause.
Okay, we live? Good. So, thank you very much. Dear distinguished guests, colleagues, students, this concludes the William J. Perry Lecture Series main event. And I'd like to thank Vice President Wendy Cutler and our very own Professor Jie-ae Sohn for a very timely and stimulating talk. This wonderful event was made possible by the support of the Pacific Century Institute, and we're honored to be joined by its co-founder, Spencer Kim, Chairman and CEO of CBOL Corporation. Chairman Kim is a very good friend of Ewha Women's University and indeed of Ewha Graduate School of International Studies, and his generosity has contributed greatly to the empowerment of a new generation of women leaders, or maybe I should say pioneers, because I was listening actively to the presentation. So one more big hand for our speakers and our sponsors. Thank you very much.